The rhythm of the cardiac monitor was too fast, a frantic staccato that echoed off the tiled walls of the VIP trauma suite. Inside the room, the air smelled of antiseptic and old iron. General Silas Heron stood by the bedside, his knuckles white as he gripped the chrome railing. He was a man built of sharp angles and rigid discipline, known for a stillness that unnerved his subordinates. Today, that stillness was gone. He watched the junior medic fumble with a clamp, the young man's hands trembling under the general's gaze. Heron didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the small room. "I asked for the chief of surgery," Heron said. "Not an intern, not a resident. I asked for the best hands in this facility." The medic swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, she's on her way. She was finishing a complex bypass in Wing 4. She's the only one certified for this level of vascular reconstruction." Heron looked down at the patient. It wasn't just a soldier. It was Lieutenant Jory, his youngest son, unconscious and pale, a dark stain blooming through the pressure dressings on his chest. Every second the monitor skipped a beat, Heron felt a tightening in his own chest, a phantom pressure he hadn't felt since the siege at Kalin Ridge. He reached into his pocket and thumbed the surface of a silver coin, a nervous tick he thought he had buried decades ago. The pneumatic doors hissed open. The sound was sharp, cutting through the drone of the machinery. Heron turned, his eyes narrowing, ready to assess the competence of whoever walked through that threshold. He expected a gray-haired veteran, perhaps someone he had served with, or a sterile, academic technician. Dr. Maren Kovic stepped into the room. She didn't look at the general. Her eyes went straight to the monitors, then to the wound. She was scrubbing her hands with a fierce, methodical efficiency, the water running clear over forearms that bore the faint, jagged white lines of old shrapnel scars, scars that shouldn't belong to a civilian surgeon. She moved with a strange, gliding gait, favoring her left leg slightly, a movement that made no sound on the linoleum floor. "Status," she said. Her voice was calm, almost flat. It wasn't a question, it was a command. "BP is 90/40, falling," the medic stammered. "Possible laceration to the subclavian." Maren dried her hands and snapped on gloves in one fluid motion. She stepped up to the table, forcing the general to take a step back. She didn't acknowledge his rank. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She simply occupied the space where his authority usually lived. "Prepare the cell saver," Maren said, reaching for a scalpel. "I need more suction. And turn that monitor volume down. I can hear the rhythm. I don't need the room screaming at me." General Heron stood frozen. His hand was still in his pocket, clutching the silver coin so hard the metal bit into his skin. He knew that voice. He knew the specific, uneven way she tied her surgical mask, leaving the bottom loop slightly looser than the top. He knew the way she stood, weight shifted to the right to protect a knee that had been shattered 20 years ago in an extraction zone that officially didn't exist. "Maren," Heron whispered. The name barely escaped his throat. She didn't look up. She was already working, her hands moving with a terrifying speed inside the open cavity of his son's chest. "Retractor," she said to the nurse, ignoring him. "Dr. Kovic," Heron said, his voice gaining a fraction of its usual steel, though the shock remained in his eyes. "I didn't know you were practicing." Maren paused. For 1 second, the scalpel hovered millimeters above the artery. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. They were cold, devoid of the warmth he remembered, replaced by a dull, hardened fatigue. "I'm not practicing, General," she said softly. I'm fixing what was broken, something you used to be very good at creating. She looked back to the patient. Is bleeding out. If you want him to live, get out of my light, or stay and explain to your son why you distracted the surgeon who was trying to save him. Heron didn't move. He couldn't. The monitor let out a long, dissonant warning tone. The rhythm was faltering. V-fib, Marin said, her voice dropping an octave, devoid of panic but heavy with urgency. Paddles. Now. Charge to 200. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Marin worked over Jory's chest, her movements sharp and violent in their necessity. Heron watched, the ghost of a burning airfield playing behind his eyes. He had left her behind once. He had signed the papers that erased her service record. He had buried the truth of what happened that night to save his own career. And now, the life of his son rested in the hands of the woman he had betrayed. Clear, Marin said. Jory's body arched off the table. The monitor flatlined, a single high, pitched tone stretching out into the silence. Marin didn't hesitate. She threw the paddles aside and placed her hands directly into the chest cavity, manual massage. She looked up at Heron again, sweat beading on her brow. Don't just stand there, Silas, she said, using his first name for the first time, a breach of protocol that hit him harder than a bullet. Tell him to fight. He listens to you. Tell him to stay. The general opened his mouth, but the only sound was the relentless whine of the flatline, signaling an end that was arriving too soon. The sound of the monitor returning to a steady rhythm was the only apology Marin offered. She slowly withdrew her hand from the chest cavity, checking the suture lines on the artery one last time. The bleeding had stopped. The boy's heart was beating on its own again, though the rhythm was fragile, like a clock mechanism that had been dropped and hastily reassembled. Marin stripped off her bloodied outer gloves. She didn't look at the team of nurses staring at her with wide eyes. She simply pointed to the closing tray. Irrigate, she said, her voice dropping to a murmur that barely carried over the hum of the ventilator. Close in layers. Watch the drain output. If it exceeds 50 cc's in the next hour, you call me. You do not call the on-call resident. You call me. She stepped away from the table, backing into the shadows of the operating suite. Her breathing was steady, but her hands, now resting in the pockets of her scrub top, were clenched tight. She needed to hide the tremor. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline crash of seeing a ghost. General Heron hadn't moved. He stood by the wall, his gray uniform absorbing the harsh fluorescent light. He watched her every move, his gaze tracking her like a weapon system locking onto a target. He waited until the junior staff began the routine work of closing the skin. Then he turned and walked toward the scrub sinks outside the swinging doors. Marin followed him. She had to. There was no avoiding the conversation waiting in the sterile corridor. At the sink, she turned on the water, the hot stream scalding her skin. She grabbed the scrub brush, digging into her fingernails, scrubbing away the evidence of his son's near death. The sound of the water was loud, a shield against the silence that stretched between them. Silas stood beside her. He didn't wash his hands. He looked at his reflection in the chrome dispenser, seeing the lines of age that hadn't been there the last time they met in a dust-choked tent in the Badlands. "You have a new name," Silas said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I have the name I was born with," Marin replied, not looking up from the soapy water. "The other one was the fiction. You of all people should remember that. You wrote the ending." Silas stiffened. He turned his head slowly to look at her profile. "I did What was necessary to protect the unit? To protect the integrity of the command. You were a liability, Merrin. You asked questions that had no answers. Merrin turned off the tap. The sudden silence in the hallway was oppressive. She reached for a paper towel, drying her hands with deliberate, slow movements. I wasn't a liability, she said, her voice soft and dangerous. I was a witness, and you buried me to keep your stars. It worked, didn't it, General Harron? The hero of Callan Ridge. I thought you were dead, Silas said, his voice cracking slightly, the first chink in his armor. The extraction chopper, the report said it went down. No survivors. A convenient report, Merrin said. She tossed the paper towel into the bin. But we aren't talking about me. We are talking about your son. She leaned against the sink, crossing her arms. The exhaustion was starting to set in, pulling at the corners of her eyes. She looked at the man who had effectively ended her life 20 years ago, and she felt a cold, hard resolve settling in her gut. He's stable, Merrin said, but he is not safe. The damage to the subclavian artery was extensive. I repaired it, but the graft needs time to seat. He cannot be moved. Silas straightened up, the general reasserting control. I have a transport jet waiting at the airfield. We're moving him to Walter Reed tonight. I want him under military care. If you put him on a plane, Merrin said, the pressure change will blow that graft before you reach cruising altitude. He will bleed out in 10 minutes, and there won't be a surgeon on board who can fix it. You will be bringing home a body, Silas. The general's jaw tightened. He looked at the doors of the operating room, then back to Merrin. He was trapped. The man who commanded thousands of troops, who moved armor divisions across continents, was paralyzed by the physics of a single blood vessel. How long? Silas asked. 3 days, Merrin said. Minimum. He stays here, under my care. In my ICU. Silas stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of stale coffee and gun oil. I can't leave him here. This is a civilian facility. The security is non-existent. You don't know who or what we are dealing with. Merrin didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable. I know exactly what we are dealing with, she said. She reached into the pocket of her scrub pants and pulled out a small, metal kidney basin she had brought from the OR. Inside, sitting in a pool of red, tinned saline, was a jagged piece of metal. It wasn't the copper jacket of a standard bullet, nor was it the jagged iron of a roadside bomb. It was a clean, silver fragment, machined with precision. I pulled this out of his chest wall, Merrin said. It didn't shatter on impact. It mushroomed perfectly. That's not insurgent ammunition, Silas. That's high-grade, subsonic tactical rounds, the kind used by special operations teams to minimize noise signature. She held the basin out to him. Your son wasn't shot by the enemy, General, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was shot by someone standing right next to him. General Harron stared at the silver fragment in the basin. For a long moment, the only sound in the scrub room was the hum of the ventilation system. He didn't touch the metal. He simply looked at it, his face tightening as if he were trying to reshape reality through sheer will. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and took the fragment. He didn't inspect it. He dropped it into his breast pocket and buttoned the flap. This conversation ends here, Silas said. His voice was low, devoid of the tremor that had been there minutes ago. The uniform had taken over again. You are a surgeon, Merrin. Stick to the anatomy. Leave the ballistics to the professionals. He turned on his heel and walked out of the scrub room, pulling a secure satellite phone from his belt before the door even swung shut. Maren stood alone by the sink. She watched him go, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. He was burying the truth again, just like he had done at Kalen Ridge. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere of the hospital wing shifted. It wasn't subtle. The elevators locked down. Two men in dark, unmarked tactical gear took up positions outside the double doors of the ICU. They didn't speak to the nurses. They simply stood there, weapons slung low, their eyes scanning everyone who approached. Maren walked out of the nursing station, her clipboard in hand. She approached the first guard. He was young, thick-necked, chewing gum with a slow, rhythmic jaw movement. "You are blocking the fire exit," Maren said, her voice flat. The guard didn't look at her. "Orders, ma'am. Perimeter is sealed. No entry or exit without authorization from General Harron." "I am the chief of surgery," Maren said, stepping closer until she could smell the peppermint on his breath. "And this is my post, Op Recovery Unit. If you block that door and the oxygen main blows, we all die. Move." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the far end of the hall where Silas was speaking with a new arrival. The new man was tall, with a shaved head and a posture that suggested he slept at attention. Major Kellen. Maren recognized the type, if not the face. He was the general's fixer. Kellen moved with a predatory grace, his hands empty but ready. He was holding a digital tablet, showing Silas something on the screen. Silas nodded, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. He clapped a hand on Kellen's shoulder, a gesture of fatherly trust. Maren walked past the guard, ignoring his reach, and stopped 5 feet from the two officers. "General," she said, "your men are disrupting patient care." Silas turned. He looked calmer now. The panic from the trauma bay was gone, replaced by a confident, almost dismissive resolve. "Major Kellen has secured the area," Silas said, "and he brings good news. The shooter has been located." Kellen stepped forward, offering a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. Kovic, apologies for the intrusion. We found the nest about 4 miles east of the ambush site. It was a rogue element, local insurgents using stolen coalition gear. We recovered the weapon, a stolen marksman rifle." "Is that so?" Maren asked. She looked at Kellen's boots. They were polished to a high shine, free of dust. 4 miles east is the salt marsh. You went into the marsh, recovered a weapon, and came back here in under an hour without getting a speck of mud on your boots. Kellen didn't blink. He tapped the tablet screen. "Aerial recovery, Doctor. Drone surveillance confirmed the kill. We didn't have to put boots on the ground. The threat is neutralized. Lieutenant Jory is safe." Silas nodded, seemingly satisfied. "The investigation is closed, Maren. It was an external attack. Tragic, but simple warfare. Now my priority is my son's recovery." Maren looked from Silas to Kellen. The story was perfect. It was clean. It explained the tactical round, stolen gear, and it removed the need for an internal investigation. It was exactly what Silas wanted to hear. It was a comfortable lie that allowed him to remain the grieving father rather than the betrayed commander. "If the threat is neutralized," Maren said slowly, testing the perimeter of their lie, "then you don't need a security detail locking down my ICU. Send them home." "Precaution," Kellen interjected smoothly. "Until the lieutenant wakes up and can debrief, we maintain high alert." "Standard protocol. Standard protocol," Maren repeated. She turned back to the glass wall of Jory's room. Inside, the young lieutenant lay still, the ventilator hissing rhythmically. He was safe from the bullet, but he was drowning in the politics of his father's world. "Fine," Maren said, "but nobody enters that room without my scrub nurses clearing them." Infection risks don't care about your rank. She walked away, heading back to the nursing station. She sat down at the computer terminal and pulled up Jory's chart. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't looking at the medication list. She was watching the reflection in the monitor. Behind her, down the hall, Major Kellen was dismissing the 2 guards by the door. He took their place, standing alone by the entrance to Jory's room. He adjusted his cuff, checking a heavy tactical watch on his left wrist. Merrin zoomed in on the reflection. Kellen wasn't guarding the door to keep people out. He was positioning himself to watch the patient, and he wasn't looking at the hallway for threats. He was staring through the glass, his gaze fixed on the rise and fall of Jory's chest. It wasn't a look of protection. It was the look of a man waiting for a problem to resolve itself. Merrin felt a chill trace down her spine. Silas had bought the false signal. He believed the danger was over. But Merrin knew the anatomy of trauma. The initial wound was just the opening act. The real infection set in during the silence that followed. She opened the digital log for the night's surgery and typed a new entry. She didn't type medical notes. She typed a timestamp and a single word in the meaningless comments field, hidden in the administrative data WATCH. She had to stay awake, because the moment she closed her eyes, she was certain that Major Kellen would stop watching and start acting. The hospital settled into the heavy, pressurized silence of 3 in the morning. It was a silence Merrin knew well, the hour when the body's cortisol dropped and death came looking for the weak. She sat at the nurse's station, her eyes burning from the glare of the central monitors. Major Kellen hadn't moved. He was still standing by the glass door of the ICU, a dark sentinel in the hallway light. He was checking his phone again, the screen illuminating his face with a pale, blue glow. On the monitor, Lieutenant Jory's heart rate drifted up. It wasn't a spike. It was a gradual climb. 90, 95, 100. Merrin stood up. The rhythm was wrong. It wasn't pain, it was panic. She walked out from behind the desk, her footsteps soft on the linoleum. As she approached the ICU door, Kellen stepped into her path. He didn't raise his hands, but his body blocked the entrance with the solidity of a concrete barrier. "Us resting, Doctor," Kellen said. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. General Harron gave specific orders. No disturbances. His heart rate is 110, Merrin said, keeping her voice low. He isn't resting. He's waking up. And if he thrashes, he will tear that artery open. She didn't wait for permission. She sighed, stepped Kellen, using her shoulder to push the heavy glass door inward before he could physically stop her without making a scene. Inside, the room was dim. The only light came from the equipment tower. Jory's eyes were open. They were wide, darting around the room, fixed on the ceiling tiles. His hands were gripping the bed rails, his knuckles white. Merrin moved to the bedside instantly. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremors running through his frame. "Jory," she whispered. Profound breaths. "You're safe. You're at St. Jude's." The young lieutenant turned his head. His eyes found hers. There was no recognition at first, only a roar. Animal terror. He tried to speak, but the dry tube in his throat made him gag. He was fighting the ventilator. "Easy," Merrin soothed. She checked the seal on the tube. "Don't fight it. Let the machine do the work." Jory shook his head violently. He lifted his right hand, the IV lines pulling tight, and grabbed Merrin's scrub top. He pulled her down, his grip desperate. He mouthed a word. Merrin watched his lips. He mouthed it again, clearer this time. "Behind." Merrin frowned. She leaned closer. "Behind you." Jory's eyes shifted. He looked past Marin, through the glass wall of the room, directly at the figure standing in the hallway. He looked at Major Kellen. The monitor began to alarm. High pressure. Jory was hyperventilating. Jory mouthed. The word was unmistakable. The realization hit Marin with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a rogue element. It wasn't an accident. The man guarding the door was the man who had pulled the trigger. The door hissed open behind her. Marin stiffened. She didn't turn around immediately. She placed her hand over Jory's, squeezing it hard, a signal to stop, to be silent. What is happening? General Harron's voice filled the small room. He looked disheveled, having been asleep in the waiting area, but his eyes were alert. Major Kellen was right behind him. The patient is distressed, Kellen said, his voice carrying a note of false concern. I told the doctor she shouldn't disturb him. Is not distressed, Marin said, turning slowly to face them. She kept her body between Jory and Kellen. He's trying to communicate. Silas moved to the other side of the bed. He looked down at his son. Jory was staring at his father, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. He lifted his hand again, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. Toward Kellen. Jory tried to say around the tube. The sound was a wet gurgle. Silas leaned in. I'm here, son. You're safe. We neutralized the threat. The men who did this are gone. Jory shook his head frantically. He squeezed his eyes shut and pointed again. He's trying to tell you something, Silas, Marin said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. She looked at the general, willing him to see what was right in front of him. Look at where he is pointing. Silas looked up. He looked at the door. Then he looked at Kellen. Kellen stood motionless, his face a mask of professional detached interest. Post-op delirium, Kellen said softly. The anesthesia combined with the trauma. Paranoia is common, General. He doesn't know where he is. Silas looked back at his son. Jory was thrashing now, the monitor screaming a warning. The graft was at risk. Calm down, Jory, Silas ordered, his voice taking on the command tone he used for troops. You are safe. Major Kellen is securing the perimeter. You need to stand down. The Jory's eyes went wide. The betrayal was absolute. His father was comforting him with the name of his executioner. Marin saw the break. She saw the exact moment Silas Harron chose the comfortable lie over the jagged truth. He couldn't accept that his right-hand man, his fixer, was the enemy. Because if he accepted that, his entire world, his entire command structure, would crumble. He's not delirious, Marin said. He is terrified. Silas, listen to me. Enough, Silas snapped. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his son, unable to face the reality of the moment. You are agitating him, Marin. Look at the monitor. His pressure is critical. He is agitated because the man who shot him is standing 5 feet away, Marin said. She risked it all. She said the words. The room went deadly silent. Even the monitor seemed to pause. Silas slowly straightened up. He looked at Marin with eyes that were no longer friendly. They were the eyes of a general looking at a threat. That is a grave accusation, Silas said quietly. Major Kellen has served with me for 12 years. He saved my life in Damascus. And he tried to end your son's life in the marsh, Marin countered. Doctor? Kellen stepped forward, his voice dropping to a menacing bass. You are tired. You are emotional. And you are bordering on insubordination. Silas made his choice. Step away from the patient, Dr. Kovic, Silas said. Marin froze. If I step away, you leave him unprotected. I said step away. Silas repeated. Major Kellen, escort the doctor to the break room. She needs to compose herself. I will call for another surgeon. Marin looked at Jory. The boy was fading, his energy spent, his eyes pleading with her. If she left now, if she let Kellen take over the security, Jory would never wake up. A complications report would be filed in the morning. A tragic embolism. She had to make a choice. She could keep her professional integrity and leave, or she could break her oath to save the life. Marin reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out a phone. She pulled out a syringe of midazolam she had prepped for emergency sedation. "I'm sorry, Jory," she whispered. Before Silas or Kellen could react, she injected the full dose directly into Jory's IV port. "What are you doing?" Silas roared, lunging forward. "Giving him peace," Marin said, backing away, her hands raised. "And buying him time." Jory's eyes fluttered. His thrashing stopped. His muscles relaxed as the heavy sedative took hold, dragging him into a deep, chemical sleep. He couldn't speak, but he also couldn't panic. And he couldn't be interrogated by Kellen. "Get her out of here," Silas ordered, his face purple with rage. "No." Kellen grabbed Marin's arm. His grip was bruising. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. "This way, doctor," Kellen said. Marin let him pull her toward the door. She looked back at Silas, who was standing over his unconscious son, guarding him from the truth, unaware that he had just isolated the boy with the only monster in the room. The corridor stretching toward the service elevators was long, sterile, and empty. Major Kellen didn't drag Marin. He guided her with a grip on her upper arm that was precise enough to bruise the bone without tearing the scrub top. It was a professional hold, designed for escorting prisoners who didn't want to be seen resisting. "You're making this difficult," Kellen said. His voice was a low hum, barely audible over the squeak of his tactical boots. "General Harron has enough on his plate. He doesn't need a ghost story from 20 years ago complicating his son's recovery." "His son won't recover," Marin said, staring straight ahead. "You know that. The moment I leave the building, Jory throws a clot. Or his pressure bottoms out. A tragic complication." Kellen didn't answer immediately. He pressed the call button for the service elevator. The light dinned softly, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the quiet hallway. "Soldiers die, Marin," Kellen said, turning to look at her. His face was open now, the mask of the concerned subordinate gone. In its place was a flat, terrifying pragmatism. Jory was soft. He was going to leak the coordinates of the safe house. He was going to ruin his father's legacy over a moral quibble. I did what Silas couldn't do. The elevator doors slid open. The car was empty, the walls lined with heavy quilted pads for moving equipment. Marin looked at the dark interior. She knew that if she stepped into that box, she wouldn't be walking out. It was a dead zone. No cameras, no witnesses. "Get in," Kellen said. Marin shifted her weight to her good leg. She looked down the hall. 50 feet away, recessed into the wall, was the zone control valve panel behind a thin pane of safety glass. It controlled the medical gas supply for the entire VIP wing. Oxygen, suction, air. She looked back at Kellen. No, she didn't run. She didn't have the speed. Instead, she let her body go limp, a dead weight that forced Kellen to adjust his grip. As he stumbled slightly, correcting for the sudden drag, Marin drove her elbow backward. She didn't aim for his face. She aimed for the bundle of nerves in his radial forearm. Kellen's hand spasmed open. It was a momentary release, a fraction of a second. Marin lunged. She threw herself not at the exit, but at the wall panel. She didn't bother looking for a tool. She wrapped her hand in the hem of her scrub top and punched the glass. The pane shattered. The sound was a sharp, jagged crack that split the silence. Kellen was on her instantly, his hand closing around her throat, slamming her face into the drywall, he hissed. But her hand was already inside the casing. Her fingers found the red lever marked OXWGNCFFGNCYONLY. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the Board of Ethics or the felony charge of tampering with life support systems or the fact that she was ending her career in a single motion. She thought about the boy in the bed who needed the world to see him. She pulled the lever down. A heavy, mechanical thunk echoed through the wall. Instantly, the hiss of depressurization began, followed a second later by the shrieking alarm of the master panel. The sound was deafening, a relentless, piercing wail that filled the corridor. "You crazy!" Kellen snarled, ripping her away from the wall and throwing her to the floor. Maren hit the linoleum hard, her bad knee screaming in protest. She rolled onto her back, looking up at him. Kellen stood over her, his chest heaving, his hand reaching for the weapon concealed at his waist. But it was too late. Down the hall, the double doors of the main trauma unit burst open. "Pressure drop in Wing 4. A voice shouted. "Get the transport tanks. Move." A team of 6 nurses and 2 trauma surgeons flooded the hallway, pushing crash carts and portable oxygen cylinders. They were running toward the alarm, running toward Jory's room. Kellen froze. He looked at the stampede of medical staff, then back at Maren. He couldn't shoot. He couldn't silence her now. There were too many eyes. The private, controlled environment he had curated was gone. Jory was no longer an isolated patient in a secure room. He was the center of a chaotic, public medical emergency. Maren lay on the floor, breathless, clutching her bleeding hand. She watched the team swarm past the stunned guards and into Jory's room to manually ventilate him. They would have to move him to the main ICU. They would have to take him into the light. She had destroyed the hospital's infrastructure and likely her own freedom. But she had broken the chain of command. Kellen slowly took his hand off his weapon. He smoothed his uniform jacket, his eyes locking onto Maren's with a promise of future violence. "You just made a mistake you can't fix." Kellen whispered. "I know," Maren said, her voice shaking but defiant. "But he's still alive." The chaos of the alarm eventually bled away, replaced by the rigid, bureaucratic order of a military police detachment. The oxygen was back on. The hallway was quiet again, save for the squeak of rubber soles on tile and the low murmur of radios. Maren sat on a folding chair near the nurse's station, her hands cuffed in front of her. She wasn't fighting anymore. She sat with her back straight, her bad leg extended, watching the scene unfold with a detached, clinical eye. She had lost. And she had won. Lieutenant Jory had been moved to the main ICU, surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and civilian staff. He was safe from a quiet execution. But Maren was finished. The hospital administrator was already drafting the statement that would revoke her privileges, and the 2 MPs standing guard over her were waiting for the transport van to take her to a holding cell. General Silas Harron stood 20 feet away. He was reviewing a digital manifest on a tablet, his face a mask of stone. He looked older than he had an hour ago. The lines around his mouth were etched deep, filled with the shadows of the hospital corridor. Major Kellen walked up to him. The major had recovered his composure, his uniform smoothed, his face back to its default setting of professional concern. "Transport is authorized, General," Kellen said, his voice low and efficient. "We have a secure ambulance inbound to take the lieutenant to the airfield. We can be wheels up in 40 minutes. Silas didn't look up from the tablet. The doctor says moving him is a risk. The doctor is a criminal who just sabotaged a life support system. Kellen countered smoothly. Her opinion is no longer relevant. We need to get Jory to a secure facility, away from unstable elements. Silas nodded slowly. It was the move a general makes. Secure the asset. Neutralize the threat. Fine, Silas said. Prep the team. Yes, Kellen said. He paused, shifting his weight slightly. One last thing, General. The chain of custody. I need to log the evidence recovered from the surgery. The ballistic fragment. Silas stopped scrolling. His thumb hovered over the glass screen of the tablet. The air in the corridor seemed to thicken, heavy with the scent of floor wax and betrayal. Silas slowly lifted his head. He looked at his executive officer. The fragment, Silas repeated. Yes, sir, Kellen said, holding out a sealed evidence bag. Standard procedure. We need to match it to the weapon we recovered in the marsh. To close the file. Silas didn't reach for the bag. He reached into his own breast pocket. His fingers closed around the cold, jagged piece of silver metal. He felt the weight of it. I never told you we found a fragment, Silas said. The silence that followed was louder than the alarm had been. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the conversation. Kellen didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. You mentioned it, sir, when you came out of the OR. No, Silas said softly. I didn't. I spoke to Marin. I spoke to the scrub nurse. I didn't speak to you until we were in the hallway, and by then, the subject was the drone strike. He turned the metal slug over in his fingers. And you certainly wouldn't know it was a fragment that needed matching. Silas continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Unless you knew what caliber was fired. Kellen's smile evaporated. The mask didn't slip. It simply dissolved, revealing the cold calculation of a man who had tied up every loose end except one. Sir, Kellen said, his tone shifting from subordinate to negotiator. The situation in the field was complex. Reports were coming in from multiple channels. We can discuss the details on the plane. There is no plane, Silas said. He looked past Kellen, toward the folding chair where Marin sat. She was watching them. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. She had told him the truth in the scrub room, and he had dismissed her as a ghost from a past he wanted to forget. She had wrecked her life to force him to see what was standing right in front of him. And he had let them put her in handcuffs. Silas looked back at Kellen. He saw the slight tensing of the major's shoulders, the way his hand drifted imperceptibly toward his waist. Silas said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The authority in his voice was absolute. The two military police officers by Marin straightened up. Sir, the nearest one asked. Take Major Kellen into custody, Silas said. Article 94, mutiny and sedition, and Article 118, attempted murder. Kellen took a step back. Silas, don't do this. You're tired. You're making a mistake. The mistake was mine, Silas said, closing his hand over the bullet. It was made 20 years ago. I'm just correcting it. The MPs moved forward. Kellen hesitated, his eyes darting to the exit, weighing the odds. But he was a soldier. He knew the math. 2 MPs, a general, and a secure corridor. There was no way out. He let his shoulders slump, the arrogance draining out of him as the officers took his arms. Silas watched them march Kellen away. He didn't feel relief. He felt a heavy, crushing weight settling on his chest. He walked over to Marin. She looked up at him. The handcuffs were tight on her wrists. Her scrub top was torn at the shoulder from the struggle. You were right, Silas said. It was a simple admission, but it cost him everything to say it. I know, Maren said. But it doesn't matter. She nodded toward the hospital administrator, who was storming down the hall with a team of lawyers and police officers. I destroyed the oxygen mains. Silas, she said quietly, caused a panic. I assaulted a superior officer. The truth about Kellen doesn't change what I did to save Jory. The law doesn't care why I broke the glass. Silas looked at the approaching administrators. He looked at the woman who had saved his son twice in one night. He realized then that the tragedy wasn't the shooting. The tragedy was that, in his world, doing the right thing was often the only crime that couldn't be forgiven. I can protect Jory, Silas whispered. But I can't stop this. They're going to take your license, Maren. They might take your freedom. Maren stood up, wincing as her bad leg took the weight. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with the same fierce clarity she had shown in the operating room. I didn't do it for the license, she said. The civilian police arrived. One of them took Maren's arm. She didn't resist. She didn't look back at Silas. She walked away, limping slightly, leaving the general alone in the hallway with the silver bullet in his hand and a debt he could never repay. The morning sun hit the glass of the intensive care unit with a brilliance that felt undeserved. Inside the room, the rhythm of the monitors was no longer a frantic warning, but a steady, boring drumbeat of survival. Lieutenant Jory was awake. The tube was out. He looked toward the open doorway, as if expecting her to walk back in. She knew, Jory whispered. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. She knew before I even said a word. Silas didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the floor, studying the scuffed linoleum like it might offer him an easier version of the truth. Where is she? Jory asked. She paid for it. Silas said quietly. In a currency this building understands. Jory tried to sit up, wincing as the staples in his chest pulled tight. Dad, she saved me. You can't let them do that. You're the general. You can fix this. Silas turned to look at his son. He saw the youth in Jory's face, the belief that rank and power could rewrite the laws of consequence. I can reduce the damage, Silas said, but I can't undo it. He looked at his son, his expression softening but remaining heavy. Some acts don't disappear just because they were necessary. Silas walked out of the room, leaving his son to rest. He walked down the long, empty corridor of the surgical wing. The caution tape was still up around the oxygen panel Maren had smashed. The glass was swept away, but the lever was still bent from the force of her grip. He took the elevator down to the lobby. He needed to be outside. At the hospital entrance, the air was cool. Maren was standing by the curb, waiting for a taxi. She wasn't wearing scrubs anymore. She was wearing a gray coat that looked too big for her, her hands buried deep in the pockets. She looked smaller without the authority of the operating room. Silas walked up to her. He stopped a few feet away. I spoke to the district attorney, Silas said. The assault charges are dropped. Kellen's statement changed the narrative. Maren nodded slowly. She pulled a pack of cigarettes from her pocket. Lighting one with a hand that didn't shake, she took a long drag, exiling the smoke into the crisp morning air. It's fine, she said. My knee was getting too bad for 12-hour standing shifts anyway. Silas reached into his pocket and held out the silver fragment, the evidence that had saved his son. I'm reopening the file, he said. Maren didn't take the metal. She looked at it for a long moment, the smoke curling around her fingers. Don't reopen it for me, she said. Reopen it because it should have been opened the first time. A taxi pulled up to the curb. Maren opened the door, tossing her cigarette into the gutter. She got in without looking back. The door slammed shut, a final, definitive sound. Silas stood there long after the taxi disappeared into traffic. The hospital behind him looked the same as it had the night before. Same glass, same lights, same walls, but something inside it had shifted, not because a major had been arrested, not because a surgeon had lost her career, but because, for once, someone chose the harder truth over the easier silence. And sometimes that's the only victory anyone gets. Thank you for staying with this story. If you've ever known someone who paid a price for doing what was right, I hope you remember them tonight.